Hey guys, tonight we begin with a civilization that did something remarkably inconvenient for historians. It disappeared. Not slowly, not with the drawn-out whimper of declining empires, not with the gradual fade that lets scholars trace the exact moment when vitality becomes nostalgia, becomes ruin. No, the Minoans did something far more dramatic. One moment, they were building palaces with indoor plumbing in 1700 BCE, while most of Europe was still figuring out how to stack stones properly, and the next moment, silence. The kind of silence that swallows languages whole, that erases names from memory, that transforms 1,000 years of civilization into a few confused Greek myths about monsters and mazes. Before we dive into the labyrinth, and yes, there will be labyrinths, do me a favour. If you're new here, consider subscribing. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'm genuinely curious whether anyone in Crete is listening to this at 2 a.m, which would be appropriately poetic. Sitting on the same island where these people built their world and lost it. Hit that like button if you've ever stood before ruins and felt that particular vertigo of realizing you're walking where someone walked 4,000 years ago, breathing the same air, seeing the same mountains, standing on stones they placed with hands that have long since turned to dust. Now, dim the lights if you can. Maybe pour something wine would be appropriate, given that the Minoans were rather fond of it. This is going to take a while, and it should. The Minoans waited nearly 4 millennia to have their story told properly. We can give them a few hours of our attention. They've earned it. Here's what I want to propose tonight, and it's going to sound strange at first. The Minoans never actually vanished. We just convinced ourselves they did because it made for a better story. The mysterious lost civilization, swallowed by volcano or wave or invading horde, it's dramatic, it's romantic, it fits the narrative patterns we've been trained to expect. But the truth is messier, more interesting, and infinitely more human. The Minoans left us everything: their art, their architecture, their innovations, their mysteries, and then they left us one final gift: the freedom to imagine who they were. Because they couldn't tell us themselves. Their writing, you see, remains largely unreadable. Linear A, they call it. Thousands of clay tablets covered in symbols that scholars have stared at for over a century, argued about at conferences, written dissertations on, and still the Minoans keep their secrets. They are speaking constantly in every fresco, every seal stone, every carefully constructed drainage channel. We simply haven't learned how to listen. Let me tell you what the textbooks get wrong about the Minoans, and it's fundamental. They treat this civilization as a prelude, a warm-up act for the Greeks, who are treated as the main event of ancient Mediterranean history. Open any standard Western civilization textbook, and you'll find the Minoans tucked into a preliminary chapter, a few pages before the real story begins with Athens and Sparta and the glories of the classical world. The Minoans become a footnote, a curiosity, the people who built pretty palaces and then conveniently stepped aside so that real Western civilization could begin. This is, to put it delicately, nonsense. It is also, to put it less delicately, a kind of intellectual theft, the appropriation of another culture's achievements to serve as prologue to our preferred narrative. The Minoans were not a rough draft. They were a complete sentence in a language we've forgotten how to read. For roughly 1,000 years, a span of time longer than separates us from William the Conqueror, they dominated the Aegean. They built the first paved roads in Europe. They developed a writing system, then apparently abandoned it, and developed another one which suggests either remarkable intellectual restlessness or some cultural upheaval we cannot identify. They created art of such sophistication and psychological depth that when archaeologists first uncovered it, they assumed it must be forgeries. Surely no Bronze Age people, no primitive culture, could have captured the human form with such fluid grace, such evident joy in the living world. They traded with Egypt, with Mesopotamia, with the Levant, with Cyprus, with the Cycladic Islands and the Greek mainland. They painted dolphins on their walls and worshipped in mountain caves, and danced with bulls in ways that still make modern viewers slightly uncomfortable, uncertain whether we're witnessing sport or sacrifice, or something our categories cannot contain. And then something happened. Multiple somethings, probably cascading and compounding in ways that turned prosperity into collapse. A volcano exploded with a force that reshaped the eastern Mediterranean, sent tsunamis crashing against coastal settlements, darkened skies across hundreds of miles. Earthquakes shattered their palaces not for the first time, but perhaps once too often. Possibly invaders arrived, Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland, smelling opportunity in chaos. Possibly their own systems simply couldn't absorb so many shocks, couldn't rebuild one more time, couldn't maintain the administrative complexity that had made the palaces function. We don't know. The Minoans didn't leave us an explanation. They left us evidence, fragments, possibilities, and a silence that has lasted longer than their civilization ever did. By the time Homer was composing his epics, centuries after the Bronze Age collapse, the Minoans had become myth. King Minos, the labyrinth, the Minotaur. A civilization transformed into a monster story, its complexity reduced to a cautionary tale about Greek heroism and Cretan depravity. The Greeks remembered Crete as a place of ancient power and ancient horror, a place where the rules were different, where terrible things had happened in underground darkness. They weren't entirely wrong. Terrible things probably did happen, as terrible things happen in every civilization. But they had lost the context, the nuance, the humanity of the people who had built the palaces and painted the frescoes and written the tablets. They had the myth. They had lost the people. Tonight, we're going to try to find them again. Not transform them into heroes. The Minoans were humans, with all the contradictions that implies, but into something more interesting than myths. Into people who built, who believed, who feared, who created beauty, and who, in the end, could not outrun their own geography. The island of Crete sits at the intersection of tectonic plates, trade routes, and historical forces. It was the perfect place to build a civilization, and the worst possible place to expect one to last forever. The Minoans built anyway. That is perhaps the most human thing about them. Section 1. The problem with discovery. Arthur Evans arrived in Crete in 1900 with money, opinions, and a determination to find something spectacular. He was a wealthy English antiquarian, the son of a famous archaeologist, trained in the late Victorian tradition of excavation that combined genuine scholarly curiosity with a fairly casual approach to the cultures being dug up. He had become interested in Crete through a collection of seal stones, small carved gems that Cretan peasant women wore as amulets, believing them to have healing properties. The symbols on these stones, Evans realized, were not random decorations but a script, a writing system that predated Greek. Someone literate had lived on Crete before the Greeks arrived. Evans went to find them. He found them. Within weeks of beginning excavations at Knossos, on a hillside a few miles from modern Heraklion, he had uncovered the largest Bronze Age structure in Europe, a sprawling complex of over 1,000 rooms. With multiple stories, light wells to bring sunshine into interior spaces, drainage systems that would not be equalled in Europe for another 3,000 years, and walls covered in paintings that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. Not the stiff formality of Egyptian art, not the brutal triumphalism of Assyrian reliefs, but something fluid, joyful, alive. Dolphins leaping through stylized waves, women in elaborate dresses, their hair coiled in complex arrangements, their expressions animated as if caught mid-conversation. Young men vaulting over the backs of charging bulls. Evans had found what he was looking for, and more. He had found an entire civilization. This is where our problems begin. Evans, being a man of his time, which is a polite way of saying a man with all the assumptions and blind spots of Edwardian England, immediately set about reconstructing what he found according to what he thought it should look like. The palace at Knossos was in ruins. Walls had collapsed, roofs had fallen, frescoes had tumbled from their places and shattered on the floors. Rather than simply excavate and preserve what remained, Evans decided to rebuild. He poured concrete, erected columns, commissioned artists to restore frescoes based on fragments. Where pieces were missing, and many pieces were missing, his artists filled in the gaps with educated guesses that became, over time, accepted fact. The famous Prince of the Lilies, reproduced in countless textbooks as an example of Minoan art. Only small portions of the original survive: a fragment of a leg here, a piece of headdress there. The rest is early 20th century imagination painted onto ancient plaster. This matters, and not just for academic reasons. Evans didn't just excavate the Minoans, he invented them. Or rather, he invented a version of them that reflected his own assumptions about what a primitive but promising civilization should look like. He saw them as peaceful, artistic, goddess-worshipping, proto-European. A Bronze Age Eden before the fall, a golden age of harmony and beauty before the warlike Greeks arrived and spoiled everything. His Minoans were gentle, sophisticated, matriarchal, a fantasy of everything Victorian England was not and, in some minds, should have been. It was a compelling vision. It was also, probably, wrong about most of the specifics. But Evans's vision was so thoroughly documented in lavish publications, he wrote a 4-volume work called The Palace of Minos that remains a standard reference despite its interpretive problems, that it became the standard interpretation for generations. We're still digging our way out of Evans's imagination. Every scholarly revision, every new interpretation, every attempt to see the Minoans more clearly has to begin by acknowledging how thoroughly Evans's vision has shaped what we think we know. He is the unavoidable starting point, especially when we're trying to move past him. The deeper problem is that Evans was part of a longer tradition of Europeans discovering civilizations that didn't need discovering. The Cretans, the actual people who lived on the island in 1900, tended their olive groves, raised their families, went about their lives. They knew perfectly well there were ancient ruins under their fields. They'd been finding artifacts for centuries, using ancient stones in their walls, incorporating Bronze Age materials into their folk traditions. But in the logic of European archaeology, a civilization doesn't exist until a European writes a monograph about it. The Minoans had to be discovered before they could be real, named by Evans after a mythical king before they could have an identity, and the terms of that discovery shaped everything that followed. We see the Minoans through Evans's eyes because he got there first with a notebook and a checkbook. What we actually know about the Minoans, stripped of Evans's romanticism and subsequent scholarly corrections and counter-corrections, is both more limited and more tantalizing than the textbooks suggest. We know they built on a massive scale, which implies organized labor, accumulated surplus, social hierarchy. We know they developed at least 2 writing systems, which implies administrative complexity, record-keeping, probably taxation and redistribution. We know they were seafarers and traders, which implies shipbuilding technology, navigational knowledge, diplomatic relationships across the Mediterranean. We know they were affected by one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history, which implies either remarkable resilience or catastrophic vulnerability, depending on how you read the evidence. Beyond that, we're often guessing, educated guessing, careful guessing, peer-reviewed guessing, but guessing nonetheless. The Minoans left us their things. They didn't leave us their words. Or rather, they left us their words, but in a script we cannot read. Linear A remains undeciphered despite a century of attempts by scholars, amateurs, obsessives and cranks. It's as if the Minoans wanted to be remembered, but only on their own terms we cannot meet because we cannot understand the language they spoke. Section 2. An island at the crossroads of everything. Geography is destiny, or at least geography is opportunity, and Crete had both in abundance. Look at a map of the Eastern Mediterranean, really look at it. Trace the coastlines with your finger, imagine the sea routes that connected ancient civilizations and you'll see it immediately. Crete sits exactly where you'd want to sit if you wanted to control Bronze Age trade. It's not at the edge of anything, it's at the centre of everything. To the north, across a relatively easy stretch of the Aegean, lies mainland Greece and the Cycladic Islands, the stepping stones that made Mediterranean navigation possible for early sailors who preferred to keep land in sight. To the south, across a longer but still manageable voyage, lie Egypt and the Libyan coast, the great civilization of the Nile, with its gold and grain and insatiable appetite for exotic goods. To the east, reachable through Cyprus, lie Anatolia, the Levant, and beyond them the ancient empires of Mesopotamia. To the west, the broader Mediterranean opens toward Italy, Sardinia, Iberia, and the distant tin sources that made Bronze Age metallurgy possible. Every major trade route of the ancient world either passed by Crete or could be made to pass by Crete with the right combination of seamanship and commercial incentive. The island was a hub, a switching station, a place where goods and ideas and people from everywhere could meet, exchange, and move on transformed. The island itself is roughly 160 miles long and rarely more than 35 miles wide, substantial but not enormous, big enough to support a significant population but small enough to be comprehensible, to be controlled from a few central points. The terrain is mountainous, dominated by ranges that rise to over 8,000 feet, with fertile valleys between them and coastal plains along the north shore. The climate is Mediterranean hot dry summers, mild wet winters, perfect for olives and grapes and grain if you manage the water carefully. The Minoans managed the water carefully. They had to. The island's rivers are seasonal, flowing in winter and drying to dusty beds in summer. Survival required storage, planning, infrastructure. The Minoans built all three. They didn't choose this location, of course. Their ancestors arrived during the Neolithic, probably from Anatolia, crossing the Aegean in small boats to settle an island that promised good living. Archaeological evidence suggests continuous occupation from at least 7,000 BCE, with the population gradually growing, villages appearing, social complexity slowly emerging. By the 3rd millennium BCE, they were building their first palaces not because they'd learned the trick from someone else, but because concentrated wealth and power create concentrated architecture everywhere, independently, inevitably. When a society reaches a certain level of complexity, when it has enough surplus to support specialists and enough hierarchy to direct labour, it starts building monuments. The Minoans had reached that level. What made Crete special wasn't just its position, but its relative isolation. Islands create conditions for experimentation. The sea acts as a buffer, protecting island societies from the constant pressure of neighbouring powers, giving them time to develop distinctive characteristics before outside forces arrive to homogenize or destroy them. Britain developed separately from the continent, producing a culture related to but distinct from its neighbours. Japan developed separately from mainland Asia, elaborating its own variations on Chinese themes. And Crete, for 1,000 years or more, developed one of the most distinctive cultures the ancient world would ever produce, distinctive enough that when the Mycenaean Greeks finally absorbed it, they couldn't quite digest it. Traces of Minoan belief and practice persisted in Greek religion like splinters that couldn't be removed, foreign elements that became naturalized but never quite native, never fully explained by Greek mythology itself. But isolation is also vulnerability. Islands depend on trade, and trade depends on networks that can be disrupted. Cut off an island's access to essential goods, tin for bronze, timber for ships, grain in years of local crop failure, and the island's sophisticated economy becomes a trap. The Minoans must have understood this vulnerability, must have worked constantly to maintain the relationships that kept their civilization supplied. Their famous naval power, attested in Greek myth and plausibly suggested by archaeological evidence, probably served as much to protect trade as to project aggression. They weren't just sailors, they were the guarantors of a system that made them prosperous but also made them dependent. And then there's the geology. Crete exists at the mercy of tectonic forces that care nothing for human achievement. The island sits near the collision zone of the African and Eurasian plates, where one piece of the Earth's crust slides beneath another with agonizing slowness punctuated by sudden violence. Earthquakes are not exceptional events in Crete. They are regular features of the environment, as predictable in their recurrence as they are unpredictable in their timing. The Minoans experienced major earthquakes repeatedly during their history. The palaces show evidence of destruction and rebuilding, the stubborn cycle of a people who refused to give up on a location that kept trying to shake them off. And 70 miles to the north, visible on clear days, lay the island of Thera, sitting atop one of the most dangerous volcanoes in the Mediterranean. The Minoans built a settlement there too, a prosperous town called Crete. They painted beautiful frescoes and lived comfortable lives, and had no way of knowing they were living on a bomb that would eventually reshape the ancient world. We'll talk about that explosion later. For now, simply note, the Minoans were gambling against odds that they probably didn't fully understand. They were brilliant, sophisticated, adaptable. They were also living in a place that would eventually, inevitably, betray them. Section 3. The Palace Complex, a building that defied categories. Let's talk about what a palace actually was in Minoan Crete, because the word misleads us in ways that matter. When we hear palace, we think of Versailles or Buckingham, or the Winter Palace residential buildings for royalty, monuments to aristocratic ego, places where kings and queens lived in splendid isolation from common life. The Minoan palaces were something else entirely. They were everything at once. They were administrative centres where bureaucrats counted goods and allocated resources. They were religious sanctuaries where priests or priestesses performed rituals whose nature we can only guess. They were storage facilities with massive clay jars called pithoi capable of holding thousands of gallons of olive oil or wine or grain. They were workshops where artisans produced luxury goods for local consumption and export trade. They were gathering spaces where large crowds could assemble for festivals, ceremonies, or public announcements. They were, if you want a modern analogy, more like a combination of city hall, cathedral, warehouse, factory, and shopping mall than like anything we'd call a palace today. Knossos, the largest, covered roughly 6 acres at its peak, smaller than you might expect for the most important building in Aegean prehistory. But density compensates for footprint. The structure rose multiple stories in some sections, taking advantage of the hillside's natural slope to create dramatic vertical spaces. In other sections, it descended into semi-subterranean magazines where rows of storage jars stood in dim coolness, preserved from the Mediterranean heat by thick stone walls and layers of earth. The whole complex created a bewildering maze of rooms, corridors, light wells, staircases, courtyards, and dead ends. You were not meant to find your way easily through these spaces. The architecture itself was a statement about power. Those who knew the paths held knowledge that others lacked. Getting lost was part of the experience, part of what distinguished insiders from outsiders, initiates from the uninitiated. The famous story of the labyrinth almost certainly originated from Greek encounters with Minoan palace ruins. Imagine Mycenaean warriors or early Greek travellers picking their way through the rubble of Knossos centuries after its abandonment, trying to make sense of all those rooms, all those corridors that seem to lead everywhere and nowhere. The word labyrinth itself may derive from labries, the double-axe symbol that appears throughout Minoan palatial sites on walls, on pillars, on ceremonial objects. The place of the double axe, the labyrinth. Of course, the Greeks invented a story about a maze built to contain a monster. The building was incomprehensible without a guide, and the Minoans who could have guided them had been gone for generations. What happened inside these palaces? The evidence suggests everything. We find traces of textile production, clay ceilings used to mark bundles of cloth, loom weights by the hundreds, rooms that seem to have been workshops for spinning and weaving. The Minoans produced textiles for export, and they tracked production with obsessive bureaucratic precision. We find storage jars large enough to hide a person inside, some still stained with the residue of olive oil or wine, some marked with symbols that probably indicated contents, origin, or destination. We find religious spaces, or what we assume were religious spaces based on their distinctive features, the so-called throne room at Knossos, where a stone seat faces a sunken basin that might have been for purification rituals, flanked by frescoes of griffins, those hybrid creatures that guarded sacred spaces throughout the Bronze Age Mediterranean. We find workshops where seal stones were carved with miniature precision that still astonishes tiny scenes of bulls and goddesses and ritual activities rendered on stones smaller than a fingernail, with detail that would be difficult to achieve with modern tools. We find evidence of metalworking, of pottery production, of the 100 crafts that sustained a sophisticated economy. And we find frescoes, the painted walls that give Minoan civilization its distinctive visual character, dolphins and flowers and processions and bull leapers, a whole world captured in coloured plaster that was never meant to survive into our time, but did anyway, through the strange luck of disaster. What we don't find, interestingly, are fortifications. Knossos had no defensive walls, no towers or battlements, no evidence of military architecture. Neither did Phaistos, the second largest palace site, nor Millennia, nor the other major centres. This absence has generated enormous scholarly debate. Does it mean the Minoans were uniquely peaceful, protected by their naval power from any land-based threat, confident that no enemy could reach them? Does it mean they had achieved some kind of internal harmony, a pax minoica that made defence unnecessary? Does it mean the palaces functioned as neutral sacred spaces where warfare was prohibited by religious convention? Or does it mean we're wrong about the walls, that fortifications existed but were built of materials that didn't survive, or were located elsewhere, or were simply never needed because the real defence was the fleet? The absence of walls might tell us something profound about Minoan society, or it might tell us nothing except that we don't have the evidence we need. This is the fundamental frustration of Minoan studies: evidence that seems to reveal something important, followed by the realization that the revelation depends entirely on interpretation, and interpretation depends on assumptions we cannot verify. The walls aren't there. Why they aren't there remains unclear. The Minoans aren't talking. Section 4. The frescoes windows onto a world behind glass. The Minoan frescoes are, without exaggeration, some of the most remarkable paintings to survive from the ancient world. They are also some of the most reconstructed, restored, reimagined paintings to survive from the ancient world, and we need to hold both truths simultaneously if we want to see them clearly. What hangs in museums, what appears in textbooks, what visitors photograph at Knossos, these are collaborations between Minoan artists and modern restorers. Ancient vision and contemporary interpretation merged into something that is neither wholly authentic nor wholly fake. Here's what happened to the frescoes. Physically, Minoan painters worked in what's called buon fresco technique, applying pigment to wet plaster so that the paint becomes chemically bonded to the wall as the plaster dries. This creates remarkably durable images when conditions are right. But conditions stopped being right when the palaces collapsed. Earthquakes brought roofs down, walls crumbled, and the painted plaster shattered into fragments that scattered across floors and mixed with debris. Centuries of accumulation buried the fragments under layers of dirt and later construction. When archaeologists excavated, they found pieces, thousands and thousands of pieces, ranging from chunks the size of dinner plates to specks smaller than coins. Evans's team attempted to reassemble these fragments, and in many cases they succeeded in identifying pieces that fit together, recovering substantial portions of original compositions. But substantial portions is not complete images. Many frescoes survive only as fragments: a face here, a hand there, part of a costume, half a dolphin. Evans's restorers filled in the gaps, creating complete images where only partial evidence existed. They were skilled artists working with the best available knowledge, but they were also making decisions about how a body should be positioned, how a face should be completed, how colours should be interpreted that went beyond what the evidence strictly supported. The most famous example is the Prince of the Lilies, an image that appears constantly in discussions of Minoan art. It shows a figure in profile, wearing an elaborate feathered headdress, walking through a field of lilies, one arm raised in what might be a gesture of command or blessing. The figure has become an icon of Minoan civilization, reproduced on book covers and museum posters and probably several dozen tattoos. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The fragments that survive include only portions of the figure pieces that may not even belong to a single original image. The reconstruction assumes these fragments go together. It assumes the pose. It assumes the context. It may be right, or it may be a well-intentioned guess that has calcified into accepted fact. This matters not to diminish Minoan art, but to see it more honestly. Even accounting for restoration, even acknowledging the liberties taken by Evans's artists and subsequent conservators, what remains is extraordinary. The Minoans painted with a freedom and confidence that wouldn't appear again in European art for thousands of years. The stiff formality of Egyptian painting, the hieratic rigidity of Near Eastern reliefs, the Minoans seem not to have been interested in these conventions, or to have deliberately rejected them in favour of something more dynamic. Their figures move, their dolphins leap, their flowers sway in invisible breezes. There's a sense of observation, of attention to the living world, of delight in natural forms that feels almost modern, or rather, that makes later Greek art, with its archaic stiffness evolving only gradually toward classical naturalism, feel like a step backward rather than forward. Take the Toreador fresco from Knossos, one of the better preserved images and therefore more reliable as evidence. It depicts a scene of bull leaping, a massive bull rendered in a flying gallop, all four legs extended in the conventional indication of rapid motion, and three human figures engaged in acrobatic interaction with the animal. One figure grasps the bull's horns, the apparent starting position. One figure somersaults over the bull's back, the athletic feat itself. One figure lands behind the bull, the completion of the leap. The traditional interpretation reads the white-skinned figures as female and the red-skinned figure as male, following Egyptian conventions for colour-coding gender. If this interpretation is correct, women participated in this ritual alongside men, which raises questions about Minoan gender roles that we cannot answer definitively. What was bull leaping? This is one of those questions that seems simple and turns out to be bottomless. Almost certainly, it was a religious ritual of some kind, given how prominently and consistently it appears in Minoan art across sites and centuries. But was it also entertainment? Athletic competition? A form of sacrifice, with the bulls killed after the performance? An initiation rite for young elites? A demonstration of divine favour? We don't know. The bulls were clearly sacred. They appear constantly in Minoan iconography, in contexts that suggest religious significance. The act of leaping over them carried meaning beyond mere acrobatics. But the specific meaning, the theology and cosmology that made it comprehensible to participants and observers, died with the people who understood it. We have the image. We've lost the explanation. Section 5. The frescoes continued what they chose to show and what they hid. The frescoes give us something precious and also frustrating. Faces. Not individualized portraits in the modern sense. Minoan art doesn't seem to have been interested in capturing specific likenesses of specific people, but human presences with something approaching personality, caught in moments that feel almost candid despite their obvious formal arrangement. The ladies in blue from Knossos shows three women, or perhaps more. The fresco is fragmentary, with elaborate hairstyles and animated gestures. They appear to be at some kind of gathering, possibly a religious festival. The way they're depicted, leaning slightly toward each other, hands raised in conversation, suggests sociability, engagement, the kind of lively interaction you might see at any gathering where people who know each other have news to share. Scholars have described them as gossiping, and while that's projection, it's not unreasonable projection. The image invites it. The Minoan artist wanted to show women in social interaction, wanted to capture something of how such moments felt, and succeeded well enough that viewers 4,000 years later feel they recognize what they're seeing. The Saffron Gatherer's fresco presents different puzzles. Originally, when it was first reconstructed in the early 20th century, it appeared to show a boy picking crocuses, a charming scene of labour or ritual depending on interpretation. But later analysis revealed that the boy was actually a blue monkey. The reconstruction had assumed a human figure where the evidence actually showed a primate. This is both embarrassing for earlier scholars and instructive for all of us. We see what we expect to see, and our expectations are shaped by assumptions we may not even recognise. The revised fresco shows a creature with delicate attention, reaching for flowers with almost human carefulness. Why a blue monkey? Was this a real scene, depicting trained monkeys used in saffron harvest? Was it mythological, showing divine or magical creatures in a sacred garden? Was blue simply a conventional colour for depicting certain animals? We don't know. The monkey offers no explanations. The monkey just keeps reaching for the flowers, frozen in that gesture for 4 millennia. And then there's the La Parisienne, a fresco fragment that has become one of the most iconic images from Minoan Crete. It shows a woman in profile, with an elaborate hairdo featuring kiss curls at the forehead and a tied sacral knot at the back of the head. Her lips appear reddened, her eye is large and expressive. Her overall appearance is sophisticated in ways that feel surprisingly contemporary. When she was first displayed in Paris at an exhibition of archaeological finds, viewers immediately noticed a resemblance to fashionable Parisian women of the early 20th century, hence the nickname that has stuck despite having nothing to do with the image's actual meaning. The La Parisienne tells us less about the Minoans than about our own habit of finding ourselves in ancient mirrors, but she also illustrates something important about how the frescoes work on us. They invite projection. They provide just enough recognizable humanity, the styled hair, the careful makeup, the knowing expression that we feel we understand something about the person depicted, while withholding exactly enough that we can fill in the gaps with our own assumptions. The Minoan woman looks back at us and says nothing. We tell ourselves what she might have said if she could speak. The relationship is asymmetrical in ways that should make us humble but usually just make us confident. What the frescoes don't show is equally telling. There are no battle scenes in surviving Minoan palatial art, no images of warfare, conquest, military triumph. This absence has been used to support the peaceful Minoan thesis, the idea that they were gentler and less violent than their contemporaries. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Maybe battle scenes existed and didn't survive. Maybe they were painted in different media, on cloth, on wood, on surfaces that couldn't endure millennia. Maybe warfare was depicted in ways we don't recognize as martial. Maybe the Minoans were indeed more peaceful than their neighbors, or maybe we're just missing the relevant evidence. The frescoes show us what the Minoans chose to paint on the walls of their palaces. They don't show us everything the Minoans experienced. There's also relatively little depiction of daily life in the humbler sense. No images of farmers tilling fields, potters at their wheels, workers constructing the very buildings whose walls the frescoes adorn. The art is aristocratic, focused on ritual, ceremony, the activities of elites. This is not surprising. Elite art throughout history tends to depict elite concerns, but it means we see Minoan civilization from the top down, through the eyes of those who commissioned and consumed expensive art. The workers, the farmers, the ordinary people whose labour supported the palace system, they appear in the frescoes only as servants, as attendants, as background figures supporting the important activities of their betters. Their inner lives, their own perspectives on the world they inhabited, are invisible, as usual. Section 6. Linear A, and the silence that speaks. Here is the fundamental frustration of Minoan studies, the locked door that stands between us and genuine understanding. They wrote things down. They developed a writing system. They had bureaucracies that required record-keeping, administrators who tracked goods, scribes who pressed styluses into wet clay and created permanent records of transactions, inventories, allocations. They stamped tablets with careful symbols and stored them in archives, expecting those records to be useful, to be consulted, to serve the practical purposes that writing always serves in complex societies. And we cannot read any of it. Linear A, the script used for the Minoan language, remains undeciphered. This is not for lack of trying. For over a century, scholars have stared at these symbols, arranged in neat rows on clay tablets found at Knossos, Phaistos, Hagia Triada, and other Minoan sites. They have counted sign frequencies, identified number systems, proposed reading values, constructed elaborate theories of language affiliation. They have written dissertations, published papers, held conferences, argued bitterly about methodology, and still the Minoans keep their secrets. We can recognize individual signs. Linear A uses a combination of syllabic signs, representing syllables rather than individual sounds, and ideographic signs, representing whole words or concepts, like numbers or commodities. We can identify numerical notations with reasonable confidence. The Minoans used a decimal system with distinct symbols for units, tens, hundreds, and thousands. We can make educated guesses about some administrative formulas based on context and structure. If a tablet lists items followed by numbers, we can infer we're looking at an inventory, even without reading the specific words. But the language itself, the grammar, the vocabulary, the sounds that Minoan voices made when they spoke these symbols aloud remains unknown. The situation becomes almost cruel when you realize that we can read the later script, Linear B. In 1952, an English architect named Michael Ventris achieved one of the great intellectual breakthroughs of the 20th century when he demonstrated that Linear B encoded an early form of Greek. The tablets found at Mycenaean sites like Pylos and Mycenae and at Knossos in levels dating after the Mycenaean takeover, suddenly became readable. The palace economies of late Bronze Age Greece emerged from silence into partial intelligibility. Scholars could reconstruct the social hierarchy, the gods worshipped, the goods tracked, the concerns of Mycenaean bureaucrats. But Linear B doesn't help us with Linear A, because the Minoan language is not Greek. Linear B was adapted from Linear A. The Mycenaeans borrowed the Minoan writing system and modified it to write their own language, just as the Japanese later borrowed Chinese characters and adapted them for Japanese. Having the key to the borrowed system doesn't give you the key to the original. Knowing how to read Japanese doesn't help you read Chinese, even though Japanese writing includes Chinese characters. The systems are related, but the languages are not. Linear B lets us read Greek. Linear A remains a cipher wrapped in silence. What were they writing about? Based on context, comparison with Linear B texts, and structural analysis, most Linear A tablets appear to be administrative records, inventories of goods, receipts for deliveries, allocations of rations, the paperwork of a palace economy. This is both disappointing and revealing. Disappointing because we want literature, mythology, history. We want the Minoans to tell us stories about themselves, to explain their beliefs and values, to share their thoughts. Revealing because it shows that the Minoans, like every other complex society, ran on paperwork or claywork. The romance of ancient civilization dissolves somewhat when you realize that someone had to count the olive oil jars. There are some Linear A inscriptions on religious objects, libation tables, offering vessels, ritual equipment. These inscriptions might contain prayers, dedications, invocations of divine names. If we could read them, we might learn who the Minoans worshipped, how they addressed their gods, what they asked for, and what they feared. Instead, we have the equivalent of overhearing someone pray in a language we don't speak. We know something meaningful is happening. We can sense the solemnity, the intention, the reaching towards something beyond ordinary life, but we can't participate in the meaning. The words wash over us and leave no understanding behind. Scholars have proposed various connections for the Minoan language. Anatolian languages from what is now Turkey, Semitic languages from the Levant, pre-Indo-European substrates that might survive in later Greek place names and vocabulary, unique isolates with no surviving relatives. None has been convincingly demonstrated. The Minoans may have spoken a language that left no descendants, that died with the last person who remembered it, that exists now only as marks on clay that no living person can voice aloud with any confidence of accuracy. They spoke constantly to each other, to their gods, to the administrators who recorded their transactions. We simply forgot how to listen. Section 7. The Goddess Question: Faith, Evidence, and Wishful Thinking. If you've read anything about the Minoans, you've probably encountered the claim that they worshipped a great goddess, a powerful female deity, perhaps the prototype for later Greek goddesses like Athena, Artemis, and Aphrodite. This interpretation, promoted vigorously by Arthur Evans and enthusiastically adopted by later feminist scholars and neo-pagan movements, presents Minoan Crete as a peaceful, matriarchal society centered on goddess worship. It's an attractive story. It has emotional resonance for people dissatisfied with patriarchal religious traditions. It offers a historical alternative, a proof that other ways of organizing society and spiritual life have existed and could exist again. It may also be largely wrong, or at least far more complicated than the simple version suggests. The evidence for Minoan goddess worship includes several categories of material. First, female figurines found at various sites, some with arms raised in what appears to be a gesture of epiphany or blessing, some holding snakes, some with bared breasts, some combining several of these features. These are the famous snake goddesses that appear in virtually every discussion of Minoan religion. They're striking objects, beautifully made, clearly important to someone. Second, frescoes showing women in prominent ritual roles, the so-called priestess figures, with their elaborate costumes and commanding postures. Third, seal stones depicting female figures in religious contexts, often associated with animals, trees, or architectural elements that suggest sacred spaces. Fourth, The apparent absence of major male deities in the art, no obvious sky fathers, no warrior gods, no masculine divine figures of the type found in contemporary Near Eastern or Egyptian religions. Evans, coming from an era that assumed all religions evolved from primitive fertility cults centered on Earth, mothers and mother goddesses, saw in this evidence a unified goddess religion. He called her the Great Mother Goddess and attributed to her virtually all the religious practices suggested by Minoan art and architecture. Subsequent scholars, particularly those looking for historical alternatives to patriarchal religions, expanded the interpretation. Marija Gimbutas, an influential archaeologist, incorporated the Minoans into her broader thesis about goddess-worshipping old European civilizations destroyed by patriarchal Indo-European invaders. Popular writers turned these scholarly arguments into celebratory narratives about a lost matriarchal paradise. The problems with this thesis are multiple and serious. First, the assumption that female figurines necessarily represent goddesses is questionable. They might be goddesses. They might also be priestesses, worshippers, votive offerings representing the dedicators rather than the deity, symbolic images we don't understand, or objects with meanings that don't fit our categories at all. Finding a female figurine in a religious context doesn't prove the figure represents a goddess any more than finding a statue of the Virgin Mary proves Catholics worship a goddess. Context matters, and we don't have enough context to be confident about what these figurines meant to the people who made and used them. Second, the absence of major male deities may be an accident of preservation or a misreading of iconography. Male figures do appear in Minoan art. The prince figures, the bull leapers, the young men in procession scenes. Whether any of these represent deities is unclear. The so-called master of animals motif, showing a male figure dominating beasts, appears on some seals and may represent a god. The difficulty is that without texts, without names, without explanatory inscriptions, we cannot distinguish gods from mortals in Minoan art. Everyone is anonymous. Everyone might be divine, or no one might be. Third, and most importantly, we have no texts. We cannot confirm anything about Minoan religion because the Minoans cannot tell us what they believed. Every interpretation depends on reading material evidence, figurines, frescoes, architecture through the lens of assumptions about what such evidence should mean. Different assumptions produce different interpretations. Feminist scholars see goddess worship, skeptics see insufficient evidence, traditionalists see what they expected to find. The evidence itself is stubbornly silent on the questions we most want answered. What we can say, with reasonable confidence, is that women appear prominently in Minoan religious art, more prominently than in contemporary Near Eastern or Egyptian art, more centrally positioned, more apparently powerful. Something important was happening, and women were at the centre of it, or at least at the centre of how it was depicted. Whether this indicates goddess worship, female priesthoods, high-status ritual roles for women, matrilineal inheritance patterns, or something else entirely, we cannot determine. The Minoans had something to say about their relationship with the divine, about the roles of women in sacred contexts, about the organization of spiritual life. They said it in images and in words we cannot read. The goddess, if she existed, keeps her secrets as thoroughly as everything else about her people. Section 8. Trade networks and the web of bronze. Bronze gave the age its name, and bronze required ingredients that no single region possessed. To make bronze, you need copper and tin, mixed in the right proportions and processed with the right techniques. Copper was relatively available around the Mediterranean Cyprus, whose very name derives from the metal, had abundant deposits, and smaller sources existed elsewhere, but tin was scarce. Tin was the choke point. Tin came from Afghanistan, from the mountains of Central Asia, travelling overland through networks of intermediaries before reaching Mediterranean markets. Tin came from Cornwall, from the distant northwest corner of Europe, travelling by routes we can only partially reconstruct. Tin came from sources so remote that their very existence implies trade networks spanning continents, connecting peoples who never met directly but whose fates were intertwined through the demand for a soft grey metal that made weapons and tools superior to their stone and copper predecessors. The Minoans sat at a crucial node in these networks, and their prosperity depended on keeping the connections open. Look at a map of Bronze Age trade routes arrows, showing the movement of goods, dotted lines indicating probable paths of exchange, and Crete appears again and again as a waypoint, a hub, a place where goods changed hands and values accumulated. The Minoans weren't just participants in Bronze Age trade. They were, for a time, among its architects, the maintainers of a system that served their interests, while also serving the interests of everyone who depended on the flow of goods. What did they trade? We can reconstruct this partially through archaeological evidence. Minoan goods found at foreign sites, foreign goods found on Crete, the residues and containers and shipwreck cargoes that let us trace ancient exchange. Olive oil, certainly. Those massive storage jars in the palaces weren't for decoration. They were infrastructure for an oil-based economy. Crete's climate is ideal for olive cultivation, and olive oil was both dietary staple and industrial commodity in the Bronze Age, used for cooking, for lighting, for cosmetics, for religious rituals, for purposes we've probably forgotten. The Minoans produced oil in quantities that exceeded local needs and exported the surplus. Wine, probably. For similar reasons, Cretan wine was known in antiquity, and wine trade follows predictable patterns wherever grapes grow well and populations want to drink. Textiles, based on the evidence of loom weights and the obvious care given to clothing in the frescoes. The palace economies tracked textile production obsessively, suggesting this was a major industry, not a minor craft. Pottery appears at sites throughout the eastern Mediterranean, distinctive Minoan forms that served as both containers for other goods and trade goods in their own right. When we find Minoan pottery at Tel El Adjul in Gaza, at Miletus in Anatolia, at sites across the Aegean, we're seeing evidence of commercial connections, though the exact nature of those connections, direct trade, gifts, tribute, loot, isn't always clear, and something harder to quantify, expertise. Minoan craftsmen appear to have been in demand abroad. When we find Minoan-style frescoes at Tel Kabri in Israel, or at Avaris in the Nile Delta, we're probably seeing either Minoan artists working abroad or local artists trained in Minoan methods. Either way, Minoan aesthetic and technical knowledge was valuable enough to travel, to be sought after by foreign patrons who wanted their walls decorated in the latest Aegean fashion. The relationship with Egypt was particularly important. Egyptian records mention peoples from the islands in the midst of the sea, and Egyptian tomb paintings show figures identified as Keftiu, bringing tribute or trade goods to the pharaoh. These Keftiu are depicted with the clothing and hairstyles we recognize from Minoan frescoes, wasp-waisted, wearing kilts, carrying the distinctive Minoan pottery forms and what appear to be metal ingots. Whether Keftiu means specifically Minoans or more broadly Aegean peoples is debated, but the connection was real and substantial. Minoan objects appear in Egyptian contexts. Egyptian objects, scarabs, alabaster vessels, luxury goods appear on Crete. Two great Bronze Age civilizations, aware of each other, trading with each other, influencing each other across the water that separated them. Trade networks create dependencies, and dependencies create vulnerabilities. If the tin supply was disrupted, war in Central Asia, political instability along the trade routes, shifts in the balance of power among middlemen, no more tin, no more bronze, no more technological advantage. If the sea routes were threatened by pirates or political rivals, the whole system could seize up. The Minoans must have understood this. Their naval power, celebrated in Greek myth as the thalassocracy of Minos, probably served as much to protect trade as to project military force. They were not just selling goods, they were maintaining a web of relationships that kept their civilization alive and prosperous. Pull on any thread, and the whole web might unravel. Mini-documentary, Thera, the Day the Sky Fell. Around 1600 BCE, the exact date is fiercely debated, with estimates ranging from 1650 to 1525, depending on methodology. The island of Thera exploded. Exploded is not hyperbole. The Theran eruption was one of the largest volcanic events in human history, comparable to or exceeding the great eruptions that have shaped the modern world. Krakatoa in 1883, which killed tens of thousands and generated tsunamis that circled the globe. Tambora in 1815, which caused the year without a summer and led to crop failures across the northern hemisphere. Thera may have exceeded both. The eruption unfolded in stages, giving residents some warning but no safety. Earthquakes preceded the main event, probably for days or weeks, shaking buildings and cracking walls. Ash began to fall, light at first, then heavier. At some point, we cannot know exactly when the people of Akrotiri, the Minoan settlement on Thera, decided to evacuate. No bodies have been found in the excavated portions of the town, which suggests organised departure rather than panicked flight or catastrophic surprise. They had time to leave. They did not have time to take everything, and they certainly did not have time to come back. What they left behind was buried under meters of volcanic material, ash, pumice, pyroclastic flows that sealed the town like a Bronze Age Pompeii, 16 centuries before Vesuvius buried its more famous victim. The preservation is remarkable. Multi-story buildings survive to their upper floors. Frescoes remain on walls, protected by the volcanic blanket from the weathering that destroyed so many other Minoan paintings. Pottery sits where it was placed 36 centuries ago, awaiting owners who never returned. The town is a time capsule, a frozen moment, a community interrupted mid-life and preserved in that interruption. The frescoes of Akrotiri are among the finest surviving from the Bronze Age. The flotilla fresco shows a fleet of ships travelling between settlements, rendered in such detail that scholars have reconstructed ship design, urban architecture, landscape features, and military equipment from the images. The scene may depict an actual event, a naval expedition, a religious festival, a migration, or it may be idealized, showing how the Therans imagined their maritime world. Either way, it demonstrates a sophisticated society with advanced seafaring capabilities, artistic skill, and the wealth to commission elaborate decorative programs. The Boxing Boys fresco shows two young children engaged in a sparring match, their youth and energy captured with tenderness that transcends the millennia. They wear jewellery, earrings, necklaces suggesting elite status. Their heads are shaved except for distinctive patches of hair, possibly indicating age grade or social category. Their small bodies are rendered with attention to the proportions and postures of childhood, suggesting the artist observed real children rather than working from adult templates. It's an image of play, of training, of the continuity between generations, and it survives only because a volcano preserved it while destroying the people who made it. What happened to those people? The evacuation saved them from the immediate catastrophe, but where did they go? Back to Crete, presumably the nearest large landmass, the cultural homeland, the place where refugees from Thera would have had the best chance of finding shelter and support. They probably arrived carrying what they could: valuables, essential tools, the portable wealth that makes displacement survivable. They may have brought their skills and their knowledge, contributing to Minoan civilization even as they fled the destruction of their particular corner of it. And then the main eruption occurred. The caldera collapse when the mountain, emptied of magma, caved in on itself, generated tsunamis that radiated outward across the Aegean. We don't know how big these waves were. Estimates vary from dramatic to catastrophic. What we know is that the northern coast of Crete was vulnerable, that settlements there were damaged or destroyed, that the palaces show evidence of disruption in the period following the eruption. Ash fell on eastern Crete, blanketing fields, potentially destroying crops. The atmosphere may have been affected, with particulate matter blocking sunlight, cooling temperatures, disrupting weather patterns for years afterward. Here's where the story gets complicated and honest. The Minoan palatial civilization did not end with the Theran eruption. The palaces were damaged, yes. There was disruption, displacement, probably suffering and death. But the system recovered. The palaces were rebuilt. Life continued for another century or more. Reduced perhaps, but still recognizably Minoan. The Linear A tablets continued to be written. The trade networks continued to function, at least partially. The frescoes continued to be painted. The final destruction of the palaces, the end of the Minoan palace period proper, came later, around 1450 BCE, roughly a century after the Theran eruption. This destruction affected sites across Crete in a pattern that looks less like natural disaster and more like human agency. Knossos was destroyed but then reoccupied. and the tablets from the reoccupation levels are written in Linear B, the Greek script. Someone new was in charge. Someone who spoke Greek, who used Greek administrative methods, who adapted Minoan culture to Mycenaean purposes. So what happened in 1450? Invasion seems likely. The Mycenaean Greeks took over, either by conquest or by filling a power vacuum left by internal collapse. Perhaps the Theron eruption weakened Minoan society enough that recovery was incomplete, defences reduced, the system vulnerable to shocks it could previously have absorbed. Perhaps the disruption triggered internal conflicts, factional struggles, the kind of elite competition that becomes destructive when resources are scarce and legitimacy is questioned. Perhaps it was simply time civilizations rise and fall, and the Minoans had been rising for 1,000 years. Entropy eventually wins. The Theron eruption was probably not the cause of Minoan collapse, but it may have been the beginning of the end, the wound that never fully healed, the first domino in a cascade that eventually toppled everything. The Minoans rebuilt after the volcano, just as they had rebuilt after earthquakes before. But each rebuilding cost something: resources, labour, confidence, the accumulated reserves that buffer against future shocks. At some point, the reserves ran out. At some point, the next shock was the one they couldn't absorb. The volcano had not killed them directly. It had merely ensured that when death came, they would not have the strength to resist it. Section 9. The labyrinth and the Minotaur memory transformed into nightmare. Every Greek child knew the story. King Minos of Crete, ruler of a great maritime empire, offended the gods through arrogance or impiety. As punishment, or perhaps as a result of his own unnatural desires, a monster was born. The Minotaur, half man and half bull, savage and hungry and shameful. To hide this abomination, Minos commanded the legendary craftsman Daedalus to build a labyrinth beneath the palace at Knossos, a maze so complex that no one who entered could find their way out. There the Minotaur was imprisoned, fed on a tribute of Athenian youths sent to Crete every 9 years, 7 young men and 7 young women, devoured by the monster in the darkness beneath the earth. The hero, Theseus, volunteered as one of these victims, sailed to Crete with murder in his heart. There he met Ariadne, daughter of Minos, who fell in love with him and gave him the means of survival: a sword to kill the monster, a ball of thread to mark his path through the labyrinth. Theseus entered, slew the Minotaur, followed the thread back to the entrance, and escaped with Ariadne, though he would later abandon her on the island of Naxos, because heroes in Greek myth are not necessarily good people. The story is dramatic, satisfying, compact. It has villains and heroes, monsters and maidens, the triumph of Greek virtue over Cretan monstrosity. It is almost certainly a Greek transformation of something real, but what? The labyrinth, as we've discussed, probably reflects Greek confusion about Minoan palace architecture. The palace at Knossos was genuinely labyrinthine, genuinely disorienting, genuinely unlike anything in Greek experience. When later Greeks encountered the ruins or heard stories about the ruins from people who had encountered them, the maze became the defining feature, the element that demanded explanation. A building that complex must have been built for a purpose. What purpose? To contain something dangerous. What was dangerous? A monster. What kind of monster? The bull imagery was everywhere in Minoan culture. Combine it with the human sacrifices the Greeks believed, possibly correctly the Minoans practiced, and you get a bull-headed man who eats people. The logic is dream logic, not rational analysis, but dreams have their own coherence. The Minotaur itself is more interesting than it first appears. A creature that is half human and half animal, born of unnatural union, hidden in darkness because its existence is shameful. This is not just a monster story. It's a story about civilization and its discontents, about the beast within the human, about the violence that underlies even the most sophisticated culture. The Minoans built beautiful palaces and painted leaping dolphins, but they also probably practiced human sacrifice, enforced brutal hierarchies, maintained their power through coercion. The Minotaur may be a Greek way of remembering both aspects, the beauty above ground, the horror below. King Minos himself presents interpretive problems. Was there a historical Minos? Possibly. Some scholars propose that Minos was a title like Pharaoh or Caesar, used by Cretan rulers generally rather than being a personal name. The Greeks might have encountered stories about various Minoan kings and collapsed them into a single legendary figure, just as the various historical figures behind King Arthur have merged into one idealized and somewhat contradictory legend. Other scholars suggest Minos was a real individual whose name was later mythologized, his actual biography lost beneath layers of accretion and invention. The Greeks credited Minos with contradictory qualities. He was a great lawgiver whose legal code influenced later Greek traditions. He was a tyrant who demanded human tribute. He was a just man who became a judge of the dead in Hades. He was a villain who persecuted Daedalus and caused his own son's death. These contradictions probably reflect the merging of different traditions, different stories about different people or different aspects of the same person, smoothed into a single figure who embodied everything the Greeks remembered or thought they remembered about Minoan Crete. The myth of Theseus and the Minotaur can be read as a founding myth for Athens, a story about the Athenians freeing themselves from foreign domination. If Minos represents Minoan power, and the tribute represents some form of Cretan dominance over the Greek mainland, then Theseus's victory represents Greek independence, the moment when the subject peoples threw off the yoke and took control of their own destiny. The Mycenaean takeover of Crete, around 1450 BCE, could be the historical kernel behind this narrative, a real shift in power, transformed over centuries of retelling into a hero story about monsters and mazes. What the Minoans thought about any of this, we have no way of knowing. Perhaps they had their own myths about bulls and mazes, their own stories about the relationship between human and animal, civilization and savagery. Perhaps those myths were the raw material the Greeks transformed into the Minotaur legend. Perhaps the Minoans would have been horrified to see themselves portrayed as monster-breeding tyrants, or perhaps they would have recognized something of themselves in the story and nodded grimly. Their perspective is lost. The Greek version survives, shapes everything we think we know, and cannot be corrected or supplemented by the people it claims to describe. Section 10. The Minoan body ideals carved in flesh and paint. Look at any Minoan fresco, any ivory figurine, any sealstone carving, and you'll notice the bodies. Minoan art presents the human form in distinctive ways that probably tell us something about Minoan values, ideals, social expectations, though we argue endlessly about what exactly that something is. The men are slim-waisted, broad-shouldered, athletic. Their torsos form a distinctive shape, tapering dramatically from chest to waist in a way that may reflect actual physique, corset-wearing, artistic convention, or some combination of all three. They wear kilts, and often nothing else. Their upper bodies bare and bronzed, their muscles defined, their postures confident. They seem to live outdoors, to value physical prowess, to present themselves as perpetually young and vigorous regardless of actual age. The few depictions of older men, if that's what they are, show figures with the same basic body type, suggesting either that Minoans aged remarkably well, or that Minoan art wasn't interested in depicting the physical decline that time brings to all flesh. The priest-king fresco from Knossos, if that's what it actually shows, the reconstruction is disputed, presents this masculine ideal in full display, tall, commanding, decorated with feathers and lilies, walking through a field of flowers as if he owns them, which presumably he did. His waist is impossibly narrow, his shoulders impossibly broad, his entire figure a statement about what male power was supposed to look like in Minoan terms. Whether actual Minoan men achieved this physique through training, binding, genetics, or artistic exaggeration, we cannot know. The image is aspirational even if no real body ever matched it. The women are also slim-waisted, almost impossibly so, with elaborate hairstyles that must have required significant time and skill to create and maintain. They wear flounced skirts, layer upon layer of fabric creating visual weight below the waist that contrasts with the narrow waist above. And they wear open bodices that bare the breasts, a feature that has generated enormous scholarly commentary and popular fascination. Were Minoan women expected to expose their breasts in public? The question cannot be answered simply. The art shows women with bare breasts in what appear to be formal, ritual contexts, processions, religious ceremonies, elite social gatherings. It does not show women in explicitly domestic or working contexts, so we cannot know whether breast exposure was constant, situational, class-specific, or purely artistic convention. Modern interpretations range from confident claims that Minoan women enjoyed unprecedented bodily freedom to skeptical suggestions that the images are idealized, ritualized, and not necessarily representative of daily dress. What we can say is that Minoan art presented female bodies as visible, as significant, as worthy of careful attention and elaborate depiction. This is not universal in ancient art. Egyptian elite women were typically shown clothed. Near Eastern art often veiled or covered female figures. The Minoan choice to display the female body prominently, whatever it meant in practice, suggests something about how women were regarded something, but we cannot say exactly what. The bodies on the walls tell us what the Minoans valued, or wanted to value, or wanted others to believe they valued. They don't tell us what daily life looked like for actual Minoan women, any more than fashion magazine photographs tell us what daily life looks like for modern women. Both male and female bodies in Minoan art are stylized according to conventions that we can identify, even if we cannot fully explain. The wasp waist appears on figures regardless of gender, age, or apparent social role. The elaborate hairstyles vary in detail but share basic assumptions about what well-maintained hair should look like. The overall aesthetic emphasizes youth, vitality, physical grace. Minoan art is not interested in depicting the old, the sick, the ugly, the disabled, or if it was, those depictions have not survived or have not been recognized. The bodies that look back at us from frescoes and sealstones are idealized bodies, bodies that represent cultural aspirations rather than demographic reality. One consistent feature is the emphasis on movement, on vitality, on bodies in action. Minoan figures leap, run, process, gesture, dance. They are rarely static, rarely at rest, rarely posed in the rigid formality that characterizes so much ancient art. Compare this to Egyptian art, where pharaohs stand eternally poised in identical positions, their static grandeur meant to convey permanence and divine stability. Compare it to Near Eastern art, where power is often expressed through sheer monumentality and hieratic stillness. The Minoans valued dynamism, or at least they valued depicting dynamism. Their ideal human was not motionless but in motion, not waiting but acting, not passive but engaged with the world. This may reflect something about their religion, which seems to have involved ecstatic rituals, dancing, processions, activities that require moving bodies and reward physical grace. Or it may reflect something about their politics, which may have valued active participation, athletic competition, the demonstration of skill. Or it may simply reflect the sensibilities of individual artists, working within traditions that encouraged certain approaches and discouraged others. We generalize at our peril. The Minoans were not a single thing, any more than we are. The bodies in the art represent someone's ideals, but we cannot assume they were everyone's ideals. Section 11. The question of sacrifice, blood, and beauty. Let me be direct about something uncomfortable. The Minoans may have practiced human sacrifice. Not as a regular feature of daily life probably, but in certain contexts, under certain pressures, with certain victims. This possibility disturbs people who have been drawn to Minoan civilization precisely because it seemed gentler, more feminine, more peaceful than other ancient cultures. The Minoans were supposed to be the good Bronze Age people, the ones who proved that beauty and violence need not go together, but the evidence is there, and it needs to be addressed honestly. At Anemospilia, a sanctuary on Mount Juctus overlooking the valley of Knossos, archaeologists in the 1970s found something that shattered comfortable assumptions. The site was destroyed suddenly, probably by earthquake, around 1700 BCE. Inside, they found 4 skeletons in positions that told a story. 3 were in the main chamber, 2 adult males and 1 adult female. 1 male lay near the entrance, apparently killed by falling debris while trying to flee. The other male, older, lay beside a platform. The female lay nearby. The 4th skeleton was in an adjoining room, on a raised platform that appeared to be an altar. This was a young man, approximately 18 years old. He lay on his side with his legs bent, in a position suggestive of having been bound. Near him, on the platform, was a bronze knife of the type used for animal sacrifice. The excavators, Yanis and Ephi Sakalarakis, interpreted this as a scene of human sacrifice interrupted by catastrophe. The young man was the victim, killed or about to be killed on the altar. The two adults in the main room were the priest and his assistant. The earthquake struck during or immediately after the sacrifice, killing the officiant and assistant and bringing the building down upon them all. It's a dramatic interpretation, and not all scholars accept it. Perhaps the young man died of natural causes and was placed on the altar for other reasons. Perhaps the scene has been misread entirely. But the interpretation has gained wide acceptance, and the physical evidence is difficult to explain through other means. At Knossos itself, in a building called the North House, excavators found something even more disturbing. Children's bones, the remains of at least 4 individuals showing cut marks consistent with defleshing. The marks were made with a fine blade, applied systematically in ways that suggest deliberate processing of the bodies after death. The bones were found mixed with edible animal bones in what appeared to be a food deposit area. The implications are difficult to avoid. Ritual cannibalism, the consumption of human flesh in some ceremonial context. The excavators, and subsequent analysts, have been understandably cautious about interpretation, noting alternative possibilities, emphasizing uncertainty. But the evidence suggests what it suggests. Someone cut the flesh from children's bones. Someone deposited those bones alongside animal food remains. The convergence of these facts points toward a conclusion that makes modern observers profoundly uncomfortable. What should we make of this? Several things, none of them simple. First, the Minoans were not uniquely gentle or uniquely violent, they were humans, capable of everything humans are capable of, including actions that horrify us. The desire to find a peaceful ancient civilization, a Bronze Age utopia free from the violence that plagues human history, is understandable but probably unrealistic. Every complex society we know of has engaged in violence, whether against outsiders, against internal enemies, against victims selected for ritual death. Finding evidence of sacrifice in Minoan Crete merely brings the Minoans into line with their contemporaries rather than setting them apart. Second, human sacrifice was common throughout the ancient world. The Egyptians sacrificed servants to accompany pharaohs into the afterlife, at least in early periods. The Mesopotamians practiced similar rituals. The Chinese buried attendants with royal dead. Closer to home, the later Greeks and Romans practiced forms of sacrifice that sometimes included human victims, though they preferred to claim they had abandoned such barbarism. The Minoans, if they sacrificed humans, were not doing anything unusual by the standards of their time and place. Third, we should be cautious about both romanticism and sensationalism. The evidence for human sacrifice is limited, a handful of sites, a few skeletons, ambiguous contexts. This is not evidence of a culture drenched in blood, of constant ritual murder, of systematic cruelty. The Minoans may have practiced sacrifice in extreme circumstances during earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, droughts, famines, as a desperate appeal to forces beyond their control. This would be understandable if not admirable. Faced with catastrophe, people reach for whatever their culture tells them might help. If Minoan culture told them that sacrifice could appease angry gods, they sacrificed. They were not monsters. They were people trying to survive in a dangerous world, using the means their culture made available. The gentler interpretation of Minoan culture is not entirely wrong. It may describe the norm rather than the exception. Most of the time, the Minoans probably lived lives that did not include human sacrifice, that focused on agriculture and trade and craft and all the mundane activities that sustain civilization. The sacrifice may have been rare, reserved for crisis, regarded with as much horror by ordinary Minoans as it is by us. We cannot know. But we cannot pretend the evidence doesn't exist, and we cannot insist that our favourite ancient civilization meet modern ethical standards. They didn't. None of them did. We don't either, if we're completely honest about what our own society permits and perpetrates. Section 12. Women in the record power, visibility, and the limits of evidence. Whatever the truth about goddess worship, the Minoans clearly depicted women in positions of significance more frequently and more prominently than most contemporary cultures. The frescoes are full of women not as background figures, not as passive observers, not as decorative elements, but as central actors in ritual scenes. The famous priestess figures, with their elaborate costumes and commanding postures, suggest women who held real religious authority, who performed ceremonies that mattered, who mediated between human and divine in ways that gave them power. The seal stones show women in contexts that appear ceremonial, even sovereign. Female figures sit on thrones, receive homage, preside over rituals involving animals, trees, and sacred objects. If we're reading the iconography correctly, and that's always an if, these images suggest that some women held positions of considerable importance in Minoan society, positions that went beyond the domestic roles to which women were confined in so many ancient cultures. But we need to be careful here. Depiction is not description. Art shows us what was meaningful enough to represent, not necessarily what was common or even real. Egyptian art shows pharaohs smiting enemies with maces, but no actual pharaoh spent his days personally bashing heads. Representation encodes ideology, aspiration, symbolic truth. Minoan art may show women in prominent religious roles because women held such roles in practice, or because the ideology of the religion required depicting them so even if practice was different, or both, or neither. What we can say, with reasonable confidence, is that Minoan culture did not erase women from public representation the way some ancient cultures did. Women were visible. Their bodies, their activities, their religious functions were worth depicting in expensive, permanent forms, frescoes that required skilled labour and valuable materials, seal stones that took hours to carve. This suggests, at minimum, that women were not confined to purely domestic invisibility, that femaleness was not considered shameful or inappropriate for public view. Beyond that, we're speculating. Did women rule? Some scholars have proposed that Minoan Crete was a matriarchy, or at least that women held primary political power alongside or instead of men. The evidence is too thin to support this confidently. We have no texts that discuss political structure. We have no explicit depictions of succession or governance. We have art that shows women in prominent positions, but we cannot determine whether prominent in religious ritual translated into powerful in political decision-making. Religious authority and political authority can go together, but they can also be separate, and we cannot assume the Minoans organised power the way we expect. The snake goddess figurines are the most famous female images from Minoan Crete. Small statuettes showing women with exposed breasts, elaborate headdresses, and snakes twining around their arms or held in their hands. Are they goddesses, priestesses, cult images, votives representing worshippers rather than divine figures? We don't know. They were found in palace repositories, suggesting they were important objects of some kind, objects worth storing carefully, objects with religious or ceremonial significance. They depict something meaningful. They cannot tell us what that meaning was. Later Greek religion, which absorbed and transformed much from the Aegean Bronze Age, gave prominent roles to goddesses. Athena protected cities and wisdom. Artemis ruled wild places and the hunt. Aphrodite governed love and beauty. Hera ruled as queen of the gods. Demeter and Persephone presided over fertility and death. This prominence of female divine figures is unusual by ancient standards. Most Indo-European religions are heavily male-dominated, with female deities subordinate to male sky-fathers. Where did the Greek emphasis on powerful goddesses come from? One possibility is Minoan influence. If the Minoans did worship powerful female deities, or if they depicted female religious figures prominently enough that Greek successors assumed they were goddesses, those figures may have been incorporated into Greek. Religion. Given Greek names and Greek stories but retaining something of their Minoan character. This is speculation, but it's plausible speculation, consistent with what we know about how religions absorb and transform earlier traditions. The Minoans had something to say about women, about their roles in society and religion, about their relationship to power and divinity. They said it in images and in words we cannot read. The women look back at us from frescoes and figurines, posed and positioned according to conventions we do not fully understand, meaningful in ways we cannot access. They were real. They had lives. They mattered to someone. What exactly they were, we cannot say with the confidence we would like. Section 13. The palace economy counting everything, controlling everything. Running a Minoan palace required bureaucracy, and bureaucracy required writing. This is why we have linear A tablets at all, not because the Minoans wanted to leave records for posterity, not because they were interested in history or literature, but because administrators needed to track goods flowing into and out of the palatial system. The tablets are receipts, inventories, allocations, records of transactions. They're the Bronze Age equivalent of spreadsheets, kept not for their intrinsic interest, but because complex economies cannot function without records. What the tablets reveal, despite being unreadable in their specific content, is a redistribution economy. This is a system we see throughout the ancient Near East and Mediterranean, differently implemented in different places but sharing fundamental characteristics. Goods flowed into the palace from surrounding territories, agricultural products from farmers, crafts from artisans, labour from workers, taxes or tribute from subordinate communities. The palace accumulated these inputs, stored them in the magazines with their rows of massive pithoi, and then distributed goods back out. Rations to workers, materials to craftsmen, manufactured items to those who needed or earned them. The palace decided who got what. It allocated resources according to principles we cannot reconstruct in detail but can infer generally. Workers received rations proportional to their status and labour. We know this from linear B parallels, where ration lists specify quantities of grain, oil and other goods for different categories of workers. Craftsmen received raw materials and were expected to produce finished goods in return. Elites received shares that reflected their status and maintained their loyalty. Religious institutions received offerings that maintained divine favour. The palace sat at the centre of these flows, a spider in a web of obligation and dependency. This system concentrated wealth and power at the centre, which was the point. The palace wasn't just a building. It was a mechanism for converting agricultural surplus into political dominance. Control the storage, control the distribution, and you control everyone who depends on you for their daily bread. The Minoans didn't invent this system. It appears independently wherever complex societies develop, but they seem to have run it with particular sophistication. The administrative infrastructure we glimpse in the tablets suggests a bureaucracy capable of tracking inputs and outputs with obsessive precision, assigning responsibilities, enforcing quotas, maintaining records across years. The system has vulnerabilities, though. It requires administrative competence, which requires trained specialists, which requires surplus to support people who don't produce food or goods. It requires trust, or at least compliance, from the people who provide the inputs. If farmers stop delivering, the system starves. It requires stability, because a single major disruption can cascade through the system, causing shortages at one point that create shortages at other points. And it requires the palace itself to remain functional. The palace is not just a building but a nerve centre. Destroy the nerve centre and the system loses its coordinating capacity. The pieces that depended on coordination fall apart. This is one reason why the Minoan collapse, when it came, was so total. The palace system was efficient but fragile. Everything depended on the palace's functioning, and when the palaces fell to earthquake, to invaders, to whatever combination of factors ended the Minoan palace period, the economy they organised fell with them. There was no backup system, no alternative structure ready to take over. The Mycenaean Greeks who came afterward adapted what they found, borrowed the script, continued some of the administrative practices. But the centuries between Minoan collapse and Mycenaean consolidation seem to have been chaotic, reduced, dark. The lights went out, and they took a long time to come back on. Mini-documentary. The Hagia Triada, sarcophagus death and its demands. Among the most significant Minoan artefacts is not from a palace at all, but from a tomb. The Hagia Triada sarcophagus, or larnax, is a limestone coffin painted with scenes that have occupied scholars for over a century, generating interpretations, arguments, revisions, and new arguments about interpretations. It dates to around 1400 BCE, a time when Mycenaean influence was already present in Crete, which complicates everything. Is it purely Minoan, a hybrid? How much reflects traditions stretching back centuries, and how much is contemporary innovation? How much is religious belief, and how much is artistic convention? The larnax is painted on all four sides and both ends, every surface decorated with images that form a coherent program, or at least what seems like a coherent program to us, which may or may not reflect the artist's intention. The long sides show elaborate ritual scenes, dense with figures and objects that demand interpretation. On one side, a procession approaches a structure that might be a tomb or a shrine. The ambiguity is probably intentional, since in Minoan thought the tomb may have functioned as a shrine, a place where the dead received offerings. Figures carry vessels and other offerings. A woman in an elaborate costume presides, her arms raised in what appears to be a gesture of invocation or blessing. Other figures pour libations, making offerings that sustain the dead or please the gods or both. On the other side, a bull lies bound on an altar, blood draining from its throat into a vessel below. This is sacrifice, unmistakably, the killing of an animal to provide for supernatural beings, whether gods or dead ancestors. Musicians play flutes as the blood flows, providing soundtrack for the slaughter. Attendants assist. Another woman in ritual dress participates, her role central to the ceremony's effectiveness. The scenes are dense with symbolic detail. Double axes appear repeatedly, that labyrinth symbol that may have given the labyrinth its name. Birds perch on pillars, possibly representing spirits or divine presences. Vessels of various types suggest the different liquids and substances offered to the dead: wine, oil, blood, water. The garments indicate status and role, distinguishing priests from attendants, central figures from supporting cast. Everything is precise, careful, meaningful, and largely illegible to us. We can describe what we see, we can identify individual elements. We cannot say with confidence what the overall program meant, what story it told, what beliefs it encoded. We are looking at a document written in a visual language we have partially forgotten. What makes the Hagia Triada sarcophagus particularly valuable is what it suggests about Minoan beliefs regarding death and afterlife. The scenes depict rituals for the deceased, offerings meant to sustain them in some afterlife or to ensure their proper passage there. This implies beliefs about the soul's survival after bodily death, about the dead having needs that the living must supply, about obligations that extend beyond the grave. These beliefs were widespread in the ancient world. We see similar patterns in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in later Greece and Rome. The Minoans shared the fundamental human anxiety about mortality and the fundamental human hope that death was not the end. The bull sacrifice depicted on the larnax is especially striking. A living creature is killed so that its life force, its blood, its vitality, its essence can benefit the dead person, or please the gods who control the dead person's fate. This is sacrificial logic in its most basic form. Something dies so that something else may live or continue or be appeased. The cosmic balance, in this understanding, requires blood. The universe is not free, it extracts payment. The Minoans, like virtually all their contemporaries, believed that maintaining relationships with divine and supernatural powers required giving up something valuable, and nothing is more valuable than life itself. The larnax was made for someone important, someone whose death warranted expensive commemoration, whose afterlife required elaborate support, whose memory deserved preservation. We don't know who. A noble, a priest, a local ruler of the Hagia Triada region, someone who mattered enough to receive this painting, this ritual, these sacrifices. Someone who mattered enough to be forgotten entirely, except for the box that held their bones and the images that showed their survivors' grief and hope. Section 14. The Mycenaean question. When the Greeks arrived, around 1450 BCE, something changed in Crete. The palaces that had dominated the island for half a millennium were destroyed, almost all at once, in a pattern that suggests coordinated catastrophe rather than random disaster. Phaistos fell, Malia fell, Zakros fell. Across the island, the administrative centres that had organised Minoan life for generations lay in ruins, their carefully kept tablets scattered, their storage magazines emptied or burned, their frescoed walls collapsed. all except Knossos. Knossos was destroyed too, but then it was rebuilt, reoccupied, put back into service. And the evidence from this reoccupation phase tells a different story. The tablets are written in Linear B, not Linear A Greek, not Minoan. The pottery styles incorporate Mycenaean forms. The frescoes continue, but with shifted emphases, more military themes, more mainland influences. Whoever ruled at Knossos after 1450 BCE was not purely Minoan. They were Mycenaean Greeks, or at least they used Greek language and Greek administrative methods. The Minoan palace civilization was over. Something new had begun. What happened? The traditional answer is invasion. Mycenaean warriors sailing south across the Aegean, conquering the damaged and weakened Minoans, establishing themselves as the new rulers. This fits the general pattern of the late Bronze Age Aegean, where the Mycenaeans were expanding aggressively, establishing themselves as the dominant power in the region. It fits the archaeological evidence of destruction, followed by distinctively Mycenaean-style occupation. It fits Greek mythology, which remembered Crete as a place that Greeks had conquered, a place where Greek heroes had triumphed over Cretan monsters and Cretan kings. But invasion alone is probably too simple an explanation. Mycenaean presence in Crete predates 1450 BCE by at least a century. Trade goods moved between Crete and the mainland throughout the late Bronze Age. Stylistic influences flowed in both directions. There may have been Mycenaean settlers on Crete, Mycenaean merchants, Mycenaean mercenaries long before the final takeover. The relationship between the two cultures was complex, involving exchange and adoption as well as competition and conflict. When the final takeover came, it may not have been a simple conquest. Perhaps internal factions within Minoan society allied with Mycenaean powers against local rivals, inviting the Greeks in as allies and discovering too late that allies can become masters. Perhaps the disruptions of the previous century, the Theron eruption, the earthquakes, the stresses on the palace system, had created opportunities that ambitious Mycenaean leaders exploited. Perhaps the conquest was relatively bloodless, a shift in administration rather than a war of extermination. The exact mechanism is lost, buried under the debris of destroyed palaces and the silence of unreadable tablets. What happened to the Minoans themselves? They didn't disappear. People don't simply vanish, even when their civilization collapses and their culture is absorbed. They became Mycenaean subjects, presumably. They intermarried with the newcomers. They adapted to new rulers, new languages, new ways of doing things. They may have preserved traditions, religious practices, artistic techniques that survived into later Greek culture, elements that the Greeks themselves didn't recognize as foreign because they had absorbed them so completely. The Minoans didn't die. They were transformed. Their distinctiveness faded as their descendants became Greeks, speaking Greek, worshipping Greek gods, some of whom may have been Minoan gods with new names, living Greek lives. The culture ended. The people continued, changed beyond recognition but still there, still carrying some fragment of what their ancestors had been. Knossos itself survived as a Mycenaean palace for another century or so, still the administrative centre of Crete, still running the redistribution economy that the Minoans had developed, now operated by Greek-speaking bureaucrats using Greek writing tablets. Around 1375 or 1350 BCE, Knossos too was destroyed, in a catastrophe whose causes are debated. After that, there were no more palaces in Crete, no more Linear B tablets, no more large-scale administrative structures. The Bronze Age was ending throughout the eastern Mediterranean, collapsing into the dark centuries that would eventually give birth to classical Greece. The Minoans were already gone. They would become legends, transformed by Greek imagination into something their actual selves would not have recognized. Section 15. The Bronze Age collapse when everything ended. The Minoans weren't the only civilization to fall. Their collapse around 1450 BCE was early a preview in some ways of what would eventually happen everywhere. By 1200 BCE, give or take a few decades depending on region, the entire eastern Mediterranean system was in crisis. The world that had existed for centuries, with its international trade networks and its great powers, and its diplomatic conventions and its shared assumptions about how civilization worked was coming apart at the seams. The Hittite Empire, which had dominated Anatolia and contested Egypt for supremacy in the Levant, collapsed entirely. Its capital, Hattusa, was destroyed and abandoned. The sophisticated administration, the diplomatic archives, the military machine, all of it vanished within a generation or two. By 1180 BCE, the Hittite world was gone. Mycenaean Greece collapsed in stages, palace by palace. Pylos fell around 1200 BCE, destroyed by fire that baked the Linear B tablets in the archive, preserving the last desperate administrative records of a dying system. Mycenae itself was destroyed not long after. Tiryns, Thebes, all the great Mycenaean centres by 1100 BCE, the palace civilization of Bronze Age Greece was over. Literacy vanished from Greece for roughly 4 centuries. The population declined dramatically. The magnificent tombs and palaces gave way to simpler settlements, smaller communities, reduced ambitions. The great cities of the Levant Ugarit, which had been a major international port, the trading cities of the Syrian coast, the urban centres that had linked Egypt to Mesopotamia were destroyed and largely abandoned. Egypt survived, but barely. The new kingdom, which had reached its peak under Ramesses II, declined precipitously under his successors, retreating from its imperial holdings, facing incursions from mysterious attackers. The Egyptian records speak of sea peoples, waves of migrants or invaders from somewhere to the north, devastating everything in their path. Who were the sea peoples? Scholars have debated this for over a century. They may have included displaced Mycenaeans, fleeing or causing the collapse of their own civilization. They may have included Anatolian peoples, pushed from their homes by the Hittite collapse. They may have been an amalgamation of many groups, economic migrants and refugees and opportunistic raiders, jumbled together by the chaos of a collapsing world system. Whatever the sea peoples were, they were a symptom as much as a cause. The Bronze Age world was failing for reasons that went deeper than any single invasion. Climate change played a role. There is evidence of prolonged drought in the eastern Mediterranean during this period, crop failures that stressed populations already near their limits. Earthquakes hit multiple sites, as they always do in this geologically active region, but now there was no capacity to rebuild. Disease may have contributed, as disease often does when populations are stressed and moving. The fundamental problem may have been systemic. The Bronze Age civilizations were interconnected, dependent on each other for essential goods, vulnerable to disruptions anywhere in the system. When the disruptions accumulated past some critical threshold, the whole system became unstable. Each failure caused other failures. Each collapse removed a trading partner, a supplier, a market, a political stabilizer. The dominoes fell, and they kept falling, until nothing was left standing. The Minoans had experienced this, on a smaller scale, a few centuries earlier. Their collapse was a preview, a warning that no one heeded because no one understood what it meant. The same vulnerabilities, the same dependencies, the same fragilities that brought down the Minoan palaces would eventually bring down everything else. The Bronze Age was brilliant, sophisticated, interconnected, and therefore doomed. Section 16. Rediscovery and Imagination. Finding the Minoans again. For nearly 3,000 years after their civilization ended, the Minoans existed only in Greek mythology. They were King Minos and his labyrinth, the Minotaur and its appetite, Daedalus and his wings, Ariadne and her thread. They were a backdrop for Greek heroism, a setting for adventures, a once upon a time that had no connection to historical reality. The Greeks themselves didn't know they were remembering real people. They thought they were telling stories. Occasionally, travellers visited Crete and noticed ancient remains. The Venetians, who ruled the island for centuries before the Ottoman conquest, built their fortifications with ancient stones, repurposing Minoan materials for medieval walls. Cretan peasants turned up artefacts when they ploughed their fields, kept the interesting ones, used the uninteresting ones as building materials or discarded them. Local tradition preserved some memory of ancient greatness, vague awareness that something significant had once happened here. But no one connected these scraps of evidence to a lost civilization. No one could. The rediscovery of the Minoans required the development of archaeology as a discipline, the growth of European interest in ancient cultures, and the particular obsessions of particular individuals. Heinrich Schliemann, who had proven the historical reality of Homer's Troy by excavating Hisarlik, wanted to dig at Knossos, believing he would find more Homeric connections. He negotiated for years to purchase the site but never succeeded. The deal fell through repeatedly, and Schliemann died in 1890 without turning earth at Knossos. Arthur Evans succeeded where Schliemann failed. He bought the site, assembled a team, and began excavating in 1900. Within weeks, the palace emerged from the earth. Within years, Evans had reconstructed not just a building but a civilization, complete with a name, Minoan, after the mythical king Minos, a religion goddess worship, a political system, peaceful thalassocracy, and a narrative, brilliant culture tragically destroyed. He spent the rest of his life elaborating this vision, publishing it in increasingly lavish volumes, defending it against critics, and quite literally rebuilding the palace in concrete and paint to match what he thought it should look like. Evans's Minoans captured the public imagination in ways that more cautious scholarly reconstructions never would. Here was a lost civilization, romantic and tragic, sophisticated and beautiful, conveniently extinct, and therefore available for projection. The frescoes, even in their restored forms, were genuinely striking. The story of discovery, with its patient excavation and dramatic reveals, was inherently compelling. The Minoans became famous, appeared in textbooks and museum exhibitions, inspired novels and films and artworks. But Evans's Minoans were also Evans's Minoans, shaped by his assumptions, his aesthetics, his political and social views. He saw what he expected to see, interpreted evidence according to frameworks that were not the only possible frameworks, and created a picture that subsequent scholarship has had to laboriously complicate and correct. The peaceful Minoans may not have been so peaceful. The goddess-worshipping Minoans may not have worshipped goddesses in the way Evans imagined. The confident certainties of early Minoan studies have given way to more honest uncertainty, more acknowledgement that we don't know what we thought we knew. This is how archaeology always works, ideally. Early interpretations are refined, corrected, sometimes overturned entirely. Each generation sees the evidence differently, asks different questions, brings different tools and different assumptions. The Minoans we study today are not the Minoans Evans discovered. They are the Minoans that a century of additional research, argument, and revision has produced. They will be different again in another century, when scholars we cannot imagine have asked questions we cannot anticipate. Section 17. Crete. Today. The weight of the past. Modern Crete is a Greek island, home to about 630,000 people, the fifth largest island in the Mediterranean, and one of the most visited archaeological destinations in the world. The Minoans are everywhere, on tourist brochures, on wine labels, on hotel names, on the souvenirs sold in every shop in Heraklion. The double-axe symbol appears on t-shirts. The snake goddess peers out from postcard racks. Bull-leaping scenes decorate restaurant menus. The Minoan past is not just heritage, it's industry. Knossos is the most visited archaeological site in Greece after the Acropolis. Thousands of tourists arrive daily during peak season, streaming through the palace complex, photographing the reconstructed columns, listening to guides explain what Evans thought he found. The experience is both illuminating and problematic. You see something the scale of the palace, the sophistication of the design, the beauty of the remaining frescoes. But what you see is heavily mediated by reconstruction, by interpretation, by the practical necessities of managing huge numbers of visitors through a fragile site. Evans's reconstructions are the most visible problem. They're what tourists expect to see, what photographs feature, what guides explain. But they're also scholarly embarrassments, creative interpretations that have solidified into perceived facts, concrete and paint, that cannot be distinguished by most visitors from ancient stone and plaster. Removing them would be historically responsible, archaeologically preferable, and economically disastrous. The reconstructions are what people come to see. Without them, Knossos would be another field of ruins, Impressive to specialists but confusing to general visitors. The ethical ideal and the practical reality exist in permanent tension. Modern Cretans have a complicated relationship with their Minoan inheritance. On one hand, there's genuine pride in hosting one of history's great civilizations, in being the homeland of Europe's first advanced culture, in having evidence of sophistication and beauty, predating classical Greece by over a millennium. The Minoans belong to Crete in a way they don't belong to anyone else. They are local heritage, local history, local identity. On the other hand, the Minoans weren't Greek. They spoke an unknown language. They worshipped unknown gods. They lived in ways that have more in common with Near Eastern civilizations than with classical Athens or modern Greece. The continuity between ancient Minoans and modern Cretans is geographical and cultural rather than ethnic or linguistic. It's about place rather than bloodline. Modern Cretans are Greeks who happen to live where the Minoans lived. They have inherited the Minoan sites by accident of location, not by direct descent from Minoan ancestors. This may matter less than it seems. Civilizations are defined as much by their territories as by their populations. The island that gave birth to Minoan culture is still there, still producing olives and wine, still surrounded by the same sea. Modern Cretans walk the same ground, see the same mountains, endure the same earthquakes. They are not Minoans, but they are the inheritors of everything the Minoans left behind. That inheritance includes ruins and artifacts and mysteries, and also the land itself, which remembers even if its people cannot. Section 18. What the ruins ask of us. The ethics of encounter. Standing at Knossos today, surrounded by other tourists, listening to guide lectures in multiple languages, photographing the same reconstructed columns that 1 million people have photographed before, you might wonder what the point is. The Minoans are gone. The palace is a hybrid of ancient stone and modern concrete. The frescoes on display are reproductions of restorations of fragments. The gift shop sells refrigerator magnets. Is there anything authentic left? There is, but you have to work for it. Authenticity is not something sites deliver automatically. It's something visitors create through the quality of their attention. The ruins offer raw material. What you make of that material depends on how you approach it. Arrive early or late, when the crowds thin and the site belongs more to itself than to tourism. Find a corner away from the main route, a section that doesn't appear in guidebooks, a wall that isn't reconstructed, a threshold worn smooth by feet that walked here before Rome was founded. Sit with the silence for a few minutes. Look at the stone that is actually ancient, not the reconstructed walls, but the bedrock foundations, the drainage channels, the floor surfaces that Minoan feet actually touched. Touch what you're allowed to touch. Feel the roughness, the warmth or coolness depending on the hour, the mineral reality of a material that was here before humans named it and will be here after humans are forgotten. This stone was quarried, cut, carried, placed by people who expected it to last. It lasted. They didn't. You are holding 4,000 years in your hand. Or better. Visit one of the smaller sites. Phaistos, less reconstructed than Knossos, with its spectacular views over the Massara plain and its famous Phaistos disc still undeciphered. Millennia, where you can walk through palace rooms with relatively little intervention between you and the original. Gortin, later in date but with the oldest law code in Greece inscribed on stone. Aegean Triada, small but significant, overlooking the sea. Zakros, remote on the eastern coast, discovered only in the 1960s, still being excavated. These places have fewer tourists, fewer gift shops, more room to breathe. They ask something different from the visitor, not passive consumption but active imagination. What the ruins ask of us, finally, is attention. Real attention, the kind that takes time, that requires slowing down, that doesn't grab a photo and move on to the next attraction. The Minoans spent centuries building these places, layer upon layer, rebuilding after each earthquake, elaborating their vision of how space should be organized and used. We can spend a few hours actually seeing what they made. We can notice the way the light falls through a light well, the way a corridor turns to reveal a view, the way the whole complex would have functioned when it was alive with people. We can wonder what they thought, what they feared, what they hoped for. We cannot answer these questions, that is the honest admission with which all Minoan studies must conclude, but we can ask them sincerely. The ruins have no interest in tourists who don't care, but they have something to offer visitors who do. Call it connection, call it imaginative encounter, call it the strange experience of standing where someone stood 4,000 years ago and feeling for a moment that the distance has collapsed. That's what the ruins ask. Sincerity. The minimum respect due to 4,000 years of waiting. Section 19. Lessons from the lost. What can the dead teach the living? What can the Minoans teach us? This is a question people always ask about ancient civilizations, and the honest answer is usually less satisfying than we'd like. We want ancient wisdom, lessons from the past that apply to our present, guidance from people who faced challenges and found solutions. We want history to be a teacher, not just a record. The Minoans were not proto-environmentalists, proto-feminists, or proto-anything else that would conveniently support our contemporary concerns. They were not ancient wise men holding secrets we've forgotten. They were people, living with constraints and assumptions that were not ours, making choices that made sense in their context and might not make sense in ours. They cannot tell us how to live. Their society was organized around principles we don't share, based on beliefs we don't hold, aimed at goals we don't pursue. They are not role models. They are ancestors distant, strange, partially comprehensible, ultimately foreign. If there's a lesson, it's probably about fragility. The Minoans built one of the great civilizations of the Bronze Age, and it lasted roughly 1,000 years. That sounds impressive until you realize how quickly it vanished once it started failing. A few decades, probably. A generation or two. The grandchildren of the palace builders lived in rubble and couldn't read what their grandparents had written. Complexity creates capability and vulnerability simultaneously. The same interconnections that make advanced civilization possible make it susceptible to cascading collapse. We are, of course, far more interconnected than the Minoans ever were. Our systems are far more complex, our dependencies far more global. A disruption in one part of the world affects lives on the other side of the planet within days or hours. This gives us capabilities the Minoans couldn't have imagined: instant communication, rapid transportation, global coordination. It also means that when our systems fail, the failure could be correspondingly greater. The Minoans couldn't have known that the volcano 70 miles away would reshape their world. We know, more or less, where our volcanoes are, metaphorical and literal. Whether we'll do anything about them is another question. But fatalism isn't the lesson either. The Minoans rebuilt after earthquakes, adapted to challenges, endured for centuries under conditions that would have defeated less resilient peoples. They survived the Theron eruption, at least for a while. They kept their systems running through crisis after crisis. Resilience exists alongside fragility. Humans are remarkably good at continuing, at adjusting, at making new lives in changed circumstances. The Minoans did this. Their descendants did this. We will probably do this too, whatever this turns out to require. The deepest lesson may be about memory. The Minoans wanted to be remembered, that's why they built in stone, why they painted frescoes that were supposed to last, why they kept records and commissioned art and invested in permanence. They wanted their names to survive, their deeds to be known, their greatness acknowledged across time, and they are remembered, sort of. We remember that they existed. We remember some of what they built, but we don't remember their names, their individual stories, their particular struggles and achievements. They have become a category, a civilization, a collective noun. The specific humans who lived and loved and feared have dissolved into the Minoans, undifferentiated, anonymous, known only by their things. This will happen to us too. It happens to everyone eventually. The question is not whether we'll be remembered. We won't, not specifically, not as individuals, not across a timescale the Minoans would have recognized, but whether what we build will outlast us. Whether some fragment of what we value will persist into a future we cannot imagine. The Minoans can't answer this for us, but they can remind us that the question is real, that civilizations end, that memory is fragile. They can remind us, by their very presence in our consciousness, that survival is possible not of individuals, not of specific cultures, but of something. Their art survived, their mystery survived, their silence strangely survived. Something always does. Section 20. The silence that speaks contemplation and the limits of knowledge. Here at the end, let me say something about the quality of Minoan presence that's hardest to convey in words: the stillness. Visit the sites when they're quiet early morning or late afternoon, off-season if possible, whenever the crowds are thin and the stones can breathe. Look at the artifacts when you have time, when you're not rushing between galleries, when you can stand before a single fresco for 5 minutes and actually see it. And you'll notice that Minoan objects have a quality of calm that seems almost deliberate, as if the makers intended them to slow down their viewers. The dolphins in the frescoes swim in eternal circles, never arriving, never departing, suspended in a moment that has lasted 4,000 years. The bull leapers are frozen mid-leap, captured in that impossible moment between gravity and grace, between launching from the horns and landing behind the animal. The snake goddess holds her serpents with an expression that might be serenity, might be authority, might be something for which we have no word. Nothing rushes, nothing urgently demands attention. Everything simply is. This is unusual. Most ancient art from powerful civilizations is designed to impress, to overwhelm, to make the viewer feel small in the presence of greatness. Egyptian colossi tower over human visitors, reminding them of their insignificance before divine pharaohs. Assyrian reliefs boast of conquest and cruelty, showing the viewer exactly what happens to enemies of the empire. Roman monuments shout about imperial glory, stacking columns and arches in competitive displays of engineering prowess. The Minoans seem to have wanted something different. Their art invites contemplation rather than intimidation. It asks you to stay, to look, to think, not to fall to your knees in awe. Maybe this says something about Minoan values, about a culture that prized grace over power, beauty over dominance. Maybe it says something about the contexts in which the art was used, religious spaces perhaps, where quiet attention was appropriate, where the viewer was supposed to enter a contemplative state rather than feel crushing admiration. Maybe it says something about the limits of our evidence. We have domestic scenes and ritual objects because that's what survived, while war monuments and royal boasts might have existed and simply didn't make it through the millennia. But I don't think the stillness is entirely accidental. There's too much consistency across Minoan art, too much preference for grace over power, for motion captured in stillness, for images that reward patience rather than demand submission. The Minoans, whoever they were, seem to have valued a quality we might call serenity or balance, or perhaps just aesthetic sophistication, the understanding that the most powerful image is not always the loudest one. This is worth remembering as we rush through museums, snap photos, check boxes, move on to the next thing. The Minoans made things meant to be looked at slowly. We can honour that intention, or we can ignore it. They won't complain either way. They've been silent for a long time, but the stillness is still there, in the art they left, in the ruins of their palaces, in the question they pose simply by having existed. What kind of people build beautiful things, lose everything, and still manage to leave something beautiful behind? There's a wisdom in not knowing. Our culture prefers certainty, demands answers, treats mystery as a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be inhabited. But the Minoans resist our demands. They will not tell us who they were. They will not explain their beliefs, their politics, their inner lives. They have given us their things and withheld their meanings. We can accept this gracefully, finding value in the questions themselves, or we can rage against it, producing ever more confident interpretations that say more about us than about them. The choice is significant. To sit with not knowing, to acknowledge the limits of our understanding, to be humble before evidence that refuses to yield its secrets, this is a discipline, almost a spiritual practice. The Minoans invite us to practice it. They have nothing to gain from our enlightenment and nothing to lose from our confusion. They simply sit there, in their ruins and their museums, patient as the stone they carved, waiting for visitors who may or may not have the capacity to see them clearly. We probably don't. We probably see our own reflections, projected onto ancient surfaces, finding in the Minoans whatever we most need to find. This is inevitable. It's what humans do with the past. but we can at least be aware of it, can at least try to distinguish between what the evidence shows and what we want it to show. That minimal honesty is the beginning of wisdom, or at least of scholarly humility. Closing, the patience of stone. We've covered a lot of ground tonight, from palace complexes to volcanic eruptions, from undeciphered scripts to uncomfortable evidence, from Arthur Evans's imagination to the modern tourist industry. The Minoans have been recovered, interpreted, disputed, romanticized, and commodified. They have been everything we needed them to be at various moments in the last century. They will probably become something else for future generations who bring their own needs, their own questions, their own assumptions. And through it all, the actual evidence remains. Stone foundations that have stood for 4 millennia, frescoes that preserve ancient gestures in ancient pigment, tablets that speak in a language no one remembers, tombs that held bones until archaeologists came to move them. The evidence doesn't change just because we change our interpretations. It waits for us to get better at understanding it. It has waited a very long time. It can wait longer. What strikes me most about the Minoans in the end is not their achievements or their mysteries, but their ordinariness. They were people living lives, facing challenges, making decisions, hoping things would work out. They didn't know they were Bronze Age, or that their civilization would collapse, or that future humans would dig through their garbage and call it archaeology. They were just living, as everyone lives, within the constraints of their moment. That they did it with beauty, with sophistication, with what seems like grace that's admirable, but it's not superhuman. It's human. It's what humans do when circumstances allow, and effort is made, and luck holds out long enough. They were not gods. They were not heroes. They were people who built palaces and painted dolphins and wrote tablets in a language we can't read and worshipped gods whose names we don't know. They raised children and buried parents and worried about harvests and argued about politics and did all the mundane things that don't survive in the archaeological record but constitute the actual texture of lived experience. They were us, or a version of us, inhabiting a world so different from ours that we can barely imagine it, but feeling things, presumably, that we would recognize if we could share a conversation. We can't. That's the fundamental sadness of archaeology. The permanent limitation of studying the past through its material remains. The people are gone, the voices are silent. We have their things, but not their thoughts. We stand in their palaces, and they are not there. We look at their art, and they cannot explain what it meant. We are alone with evidence that gestures toward meanings we cannot fully grasp. But something remains, not just ruins, but presence, not just artifacts, but invitation. The invitation to pay attention, the invitation to slow down, the invitation to stand before 4,000-year-old stone and feel, for a moment, that time has folded in on itself, that the past is not past but merely waiting, as it has always been waiting, for someone to notice it is still there. The sea still surrounds the island, the mountains still rise, the earthquakes still come, as they always have and always will, and on the hillsides, under the olive trees, the limestone foundations of Minoan palaces settle a little deeper into the earth each year, patient as the stone they're made of. They do not forget. They do not forgive. They simply wait. That is, perhaps, the only wisdom the Minoans still offer. The wisdom of waiting. The wisdom of having built something that lasts. The wisdom of silence that speaks more loudly than any boast, any conquest, any claim of greatness could speak. The Minoans are still here, in their stone and their mystery and their stubborn refusal to be fully understood. They will be here long after we are gone. They have time. They have always had time. Time is the only thing they have in abundance. And somewhere in that patience, in that persistence, in that 4,000-year willingness to wait for someone to finally understand, there is something that feels, if not quite like hope, then at least like its quieter cousin. The assurance that even when civilizations fall, even when languages die, even when everything we know is buried under ash and soil and centuries, something remains. Something always remains. The Minoans knew this, or they acted as if they knew it. Building in stone, painting on walls, carving on clay, they made their mark, and then they vanished, leaving us to puzzle out what the mark meant. We're still puzzling. We probably always will be. But the puzzling itself is a form of connection, a thread stretching across the millennia, linking people who will never meet, who cannot speak each other's languages, who live in worlds as different as worlds can be. That thread is fragile, but it hasn't broken yet, and as long as we keep pulling on it, keep wondering, keep paying attention, it won't break. The Minoans will go on waiting. We will go on asking, and somewhere in between, in that strange space where present and past touch, where the living encounter the dead, where ruins become teachers and silence becomes eloquence, something endures that deserves the name wisdom, or at least the name mystery, which may in the end be the same thing. It is late. The museum is closing. The tourists are leaving. The ruins stand under stars that the Minoans also saw, that they also wondered about, that still turn above an island that has outlasted every civilization that ever called it home. Go to sleep now. Dream of dolphins and labyrinths and languages no one remembers. Dream of volcanoes and bull leapers and priestesses holding snakes. Dream of palace corridors that never end and frescoes that fade into fragments and tablets that speak in symbols we cannot decode. And when you wake, remember that the Minoans woke too, on mornings just like this one, under a sky just like this one, with no more idea than we have of what the future held. They faced uncertainty with creation. They answered impermanence with beauty. They knew at some level that nothing lasts, and they built anyway. They built anyway. So can we. Good night.